Taking a look at this chainsaw, you wouldn't think it was anything too special. Yes, it's a good saw from a fairly good brand, but when I was handed this saw from a coworker and I took it apart, I soon realized just how special it really was. Unfortunately, because it's special or unique, depending upon how you look at it, getting parts for it can be a bit tricky. In today's video, we look at this chainsaw and the problem is that it wouldn't start. Now in the last video, we were able to figure out that the carb was the issue. After taking it apart, we found out it has a very unique part inside it. If you didn't see that part of the repair and would like to understand what I'm talking about, there should be a link at the top of the screen. Otherwise, we'll continue working on it and hopefully we'll get it running by the end of this video. Now, I'm going to try and repair this chainsaw, but yours might be a little different, so it might not work on yours. If things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. In the last video, we found out that the carb was the issue, and how we figured that out was, well, we tried to start it. Now, of course, it wasn't going to start because, as we figured out later on, the fuel lines and purge bulb were broken. But before finding that out, we tried putting fuel into the carb's throat and tried starting it. The viewers also gave me a tip, which was to spray the fuel on the air filter, which would also work as well. After doing that, this is what happened. After confirming that it does start and run with fuel put into the carb, it was just a matter of taking the saw apart to get to the carb, which I have to say on this particular saw is not easy as some of the other brands or models. Now normally the metering diaphragm is the main problem with the carb, so I carry 4 different types of them on hand. Now once the carb was apart, I was guessing it was just a matter of cleaning the carb and replacing the diaphragm, but I was in for a nasty surprise. So it turns out the diaphragm is beginning to harden, which means it won't be able to move the rocker arm and control the fuel flow through the carb. The surprise, however, was that the diaphragm was not one of the ones I normally carry, and in fact, I don't think I've ever seen this style before. It has 4 bolt holes, 2 locating tabs, and 2 smaller openings located between them, and 1 larger opening at the opposite end. So what's the plan this time? So here's the situation. I can either try to soak the diaphragm in my rejuvenation fluid or try buying a new metering diaphragm, and that's if I can find the right one. There is a third option that I think might work, but it's risky. I do have a diaphragm that looks like this one, but it's missing some of the smaller openings. What I plan on doing is using my soldering iron to make the missing openings using the old diaphragm as a template. Now this is going to be a tough one for me. If I choose either of the first 2 options, it's going to be a waiting game, so time is going to be the issue. While I weigh my options, I'm going to replace the old and broken fuel lines and purge bulb. Now the fuel line size I'm using is sized at 3/16 of an inch, and that of course is the outside diameter. You don't have to use this yellow fuel line. In fact, use whichever kind you want, whether it be clear or even rubber. The line that I just ran to the opening on the right side of the tank is going to be the fuel return line. Now when pulling the line into the tank, I'd like to leave at least an inch of line inside it. This will help keep the line from coming out. After running the return line, I'm now going to run the fuel filter line, and it goes to the left side of the tank. The line size I'm going to be using is a little bit smaller at 140 thousandths of an inch. When pulling the line into the tank and out of the opening, make sure it's long enough to allow the filter to reach all the fuel in the tank. Now I am going to reuse the old filter, but if yours is in bad condition, it might be a good idea to replace it because they're not that expensive. After that, make sure to leave plenty of line outside of the tank because it needs to run across the carb to the barb on the right side. Now after thinking about it and talking it over, I think I finally came to a decision about the diaphragm, and it's not going to be a popular one. So here's the old diaphragm, and as you can see, it has a lot more openings in it than a normal one. My plan is to use my closest diaphragm and make the extra openings in it using my soldering iron. The problem is that if this doesn't work, I'll have wasted my time trying to get it to work versus just ordering this very unique configuration of metering diaphragms. If this doesn't work out, I'm going to owe some people an apology. So I ran into a very serious situation. I was not able to remove this tiny bolt holding the rocker arm to the carb. The reason this is a problem is that I need to remove the needle so I can use carb cleaner on it. Unfortunately, not being able to remove it means I'm not even going to attempt to clean it, which could prove to be a very bad situation. Now after trying to install the diaphragm, I had to make a few more holes than I thought for the locating tabs, but after that, I should be able to put the carb back together. I don't believe a lot of viewers are going to agree with me on my choice of how I'm going to fix this carb, and I completely understand the feeling. This is quite the gamble, so hopefully it works out. Now, an aftermarket carb for this saw isn't all that expensive, so that's probably going to be the next option. So what about buying a new metering diaphragm instead? Well, I was able to find them, and they were actually a decent price. The problem is the time for delivery was over 2 weeks, which in my book is just insane. So when connecting the fuel lines, it's best to install a short fuel line on the left side port on the carb at first, because it's tough to do when the carb is already installed. After that, I'll then take the filter line and install it to the right side port. Then we can slide the carb onto the studs. Next, we can position the line we just connected to the left side port through the opening for the bulb. Then we can install the filter base onto the studs and run the return line around it and into the opening for the bulb. I will say this, I'm not a fan of this particular design because working on the carb takes more effort than, say, a typical design. Nothing wrong with it, but I feel it's a bit unnecessary. However, I'm sure it has to do with the way the engine is designed, and it wasn't meant to be a poor design. Now, if they were to offer this chainsaw to me, I would take it, but if I was given a choice to work on this design over a conventional one, I would take the conventional one any day of the week. Now, when connecting the fuel lines to the bulb, the short line that goes to the left side port on the carb will connect to the short port on the bulb. That means the return line that goes back to the tank will then connect to the longer port on the bulb. After that, we can then snap the bulb into its opening. Now, I use a fully synthetic 2-stroke oil that's also been stabilized, but use whichever 2-stroke oil you can find, and also mix it to the correct ratio, otherwise you could damage the engine. Once this part is done, we can then reconnect the handle to the rest of the machine, but before we try and start it, I'm going to check where the adjustment screws have been set to. I've gotten some comments on what the default settings are supposed to be, but I'm not really sure, so I want to see what they're set to on this one. That way we can put it back the way we found them if we need to. So to find out where the settings are, I'm going to turn the screws clockwise until the screws stop turning. I'm going to count how many turns it takes, and then we'll know what the settings are. On the L screw, it looks to be 2 turns to bottom out the screw. After that, I'll then turn them back out to the same amount. Then we'll do the same for the H screw. Now, these may have been adjusted at some point in the saw's lifetime, so in no way am I saying that these are the factory settings. So what appears the H screw is 1 3/4 turns out. If for some reason I found the screws to be too far out or too far in, more than likely someone was playing with the screws trying to get it to work again. Nothing wrong with it, but if I had to do it, I'd probably set them at 1.5 turns as a default to start with. Next, I'll turn them back out the same number of turns, then replace the top cover so we can finally try and start it. So it seems like the gamble paid off and the chainsaw is working just like it's supposed to. Now the chain isn't all that dull, but it wouldn't hurt to be sharpened either. I'm really glad this worked out because it means they can get their saw back sooner than later. Another reason why this chainsaw might not be starting is because the engine has been damaged and the piston ring and cylinder are scored. This would cause the engine to be low on compression, which of course means the air-fuel mixture is unlikely to ignite. The fix would be, unfortunately, to rebuild the engine, which might be more expensive than buying a used working saw. So in the end, the saw is working, and yes, the way we went about it was unconventional, but it still worked out. Now, would I recommend doing what I did? And the answer is no. Just order the right part and wait for it to arrive in the mail. So my question is pretty obvious. Would you even attempt what I did, not knowing if it was going to work? To be honest, I'll probably try something this idiotic again, but the chances of it working again is not in my favor. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.